There's a moment in every war when someone on the wrong side of history realizes they've made a catastrophic mistake. I've covered 43 conflicts across 9 star systems. I've watched species that evolved over millions of years crumble in an afternoon. I've seen battle cruisers the size of small moons get reduced to debris fields that took decades to clear. I thought I'd seen everything. I thought I understood what war was, what it looked like, what it smelled like, what it did to the beings who survived it. Then I watched humanity fight. And I understood, for the first time in my long career, that I had never actually understood anything at all. Let me start from the beginning, because if I just tell you what happened at the siege of Varanthos Station, you won't believe me. Nobody believed me at first. The Tribune ran my report and their editorial board flagged it 3 times for probable factual embellishment. One of the senior editors, a Cathali named Orvast who'd been in the business longer than some civilizations had existed, sent me a message that said, and I'm translating loosely here, "Vex, I've known you for 60 years. I've always trusted your reporting. Are you certain you weren't suffering from oxygen deprivation when you filed this?" I wasn't suffering from oxygen deprivation. I was suffering from something much harder to explain, a kind of awe that sits in the chest and refuses to move. A disorientation that comes from watching your entire understanding of the universe get quietly folded up and put away, like someone had just told you that gravity was optional, and then demonstrated it. That's what humanity did to me, to all of us. So, the beginning. Part 1, the war nobody thought would matter. The Vethari expansion campaign started the way most galactic conflicts start, with a resource dispute that someone decided was worth bleeding over. The Vethari collective had been moving outward from their home cluster for about 3 centuries, by galactic standard reckoning. They weren't what you'd call aggressive, not exactly. They were more like water. They found the path of least resistance and they flowed into it. If a system was undefended, they moved in. If a species was diplomatically isolated, they absorbed them. If a trade route could be rerouted through their territory with just a little applied pressure, that pressure was applied. For a long time, they were considered an annoyance more than a threat. Then they hit the Dranathi corridor. The Dranathi corridor is, well, if you understand galactic commerce at all, you understand what the corridor means. It's the primary transit lane connecting the outer reach systems to the inner markets. 12,000 trade ships pass through it every standard year. The tariff revenues alone fund the infrastructure of 6 minor civilizations. Whoever controls the corridor doesn't control the galaxy exactly, but they control enough of it to make everyone else very uncomfortable. The Vethari wanted it. The Galactic Coalition said no. The Vethari said, and again I'm translating loosely, we weren't really asking. And that's how the war started. I arrived at the Coalition military staging area on Pella's IV about 6 weeks into the campaign. By that point, the early assessments were already looking grim. The Vethari had 17 battle fleets positioned across the corridor approach vectors. The Coalition had mustered 11, and 3 of those were reserve units that hadn't seen active deployment in over a century. The mood on Pella's IV was tense in a very specific way, not panicked, but carefully controlled. The kind of tense where everyone is trying very hard to look like they're not worried, which of course makes the worry more obvious, not less. I remember walking through the main operations compound the morning after I landed. It was just after local dawn, and the compound was already buzzing, staff officers moving between briefing modules, logistics coordinators arguing over manifest schedules, a cluster of Cathali engineers running diagnostics on a prefab shielding array that looked like it had seen better centuries. And then I heard it. Laughing. Not nervous laughing. Not the tight, compressed kind of laughter you get when someone makes a joke to break the tension in a command center. This was real laughing. The kind that doesn't care who hears it. The kind that comes from the belly and just falls out of someone like they can't help it. I turned because in a military staging compound at the opening of a war, that kind of laughter is genuinely disorienting. There were 4 of them sitting on supply crates near the eastern perimeter wall. Humans. They were wearing Coalition auxiliary uniforms. The designation patches on their shoulders marked them as members of Terran Division 6, which was one of the auxiliary support units the Coalition had been integrating into their structure over the past decade or so. One of them had a container of something steaming. I later learned it was a Terran beverage called coffee, which I'll come back to, because coffee is its own entire subject, and she was apparently telling a story that was making the other three lose their composure completely. They were maybe 30 meters away from a briefing room where senior coalition officers were discussing casualty projections. They were laughing like they were at some kind of social gathering. I watched them for a moment longer than I probably should have. Then I went to find my briefing contact. But I kept thinking about that, laughing. My contact on Pella's IV was a coalition intelligence officer named Dreth Vassano. A Melurian, compact and careful the way Melurians always are, with that particular quality of stillness they have when they're thinking hard about something. We'd worked together twice before, during the Outer Reach arbitration talks, and I trusted him as much as I trusted anyone in an official capacity, which is to say moderately and with appropriate skepticism. He met me in a small briefing room that smelled like recycled air and old tactical maps, and he looked tired. Not the kind of tired you get from a long shift, the kind you get from carrying something heavy for too long. "Vex," he said, and gestured at a chair. I sat. He pulled up a holographic display, the Dranathi corridor, rendered in blue light with red indicators showing Vethari fleet positions. There were a lot of red indicators. "It's worse than the public release," he said, which I already knew, because the public release had been composed by a communications team whose primary function was managing morale, not conveying information. "How much worse?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Vethari have a new weapons system. We're calling it the Dissonance Array. We don't fully understand how it works yet, but the preliminary assessments suggest it operates by disrupting the resonance fields in standard coalition shielding matrices. Meaning our shields don't work against it." He said it very flatly, the way Melurians deliver bad news, without the vocal inflections that some species add to soften things. "We've been running simulations. Against the Dissonance Array, a standard coalition battle cruiser has a survivability window of approximately 45 seconds once targeting lock is achieved." I let that sit for a moment. 45 seconds. "What's the coalition response plan?" I asked. Dreth was quiet again. This quiet was different, longer, with a quality of reluctance in it. "There are several tactical options being evaluated," he said carefully. "Dreth." He looked at me. "What's the actual plan?" He tapped the holographic display and the image shifted. The corridor map zoomed out to show a broader strategic view, and I saw a cluster of blue indicators I hadn't noticed before, positioned well behind the main coalition fleet staging areas. A lot of blue indicators. "Terran Division 6, he said, and 3 other Terran auxiliary units were accelerating their integration into active combat roles. I stared at the display. "The humans, you're putting the human auxiliaries into frontline positions." "Not exactly frontline, he paused, chose his words. "We're repositioning them." "Dreth, the Terran auxiliaries have been part of the coalition framework for 8 years? They're logistics support, medical units, some communications work. They've never been in a combat deployment." "I know. The Vethari have 17 battle fleets and a weapons system that makes our shields useless in 45 seconds. "I know. And your response is to put human auxiliaries in active positions." He closed the holographic display. The room felt smaller without the blue light. "The Council is out of options, Vex," he said. "The conventional military analysis says we can't hold the corridor, not with what we have, not against the Dissonance Array." He leaned back in his chair and rubbed one of his secondary eyes, a Melurian stress gesture I'd learned to recognize. "The Terran proposal has been sitting in the evaluation queue for 2 years. Nobody wanted to activate it because nobody wanted to be responsible for—" He stopped. "For what?" "For what it implies," he said after a moment, "about them." I didn't know what that meant, not yet. "They gave me access to the Terran Division 6 compound the following morning, under the condition that I embedded with their unit and filed no reports until after operational commencement. Standard wartime conditions." I agreed. The compound was in the northeastern section of Pella's IV's main military installation, separated from the coalition regular forces by about half a kilometer of open ground that served as an unofficial buffer. Not official segregation. The Coalition's integration framework explicitly prohibited that, but the kind of organic separation that happens when different groups are just different enough that they naturally cluster. I'd interacted with humans before. Several times, actually. The Tribune had run feature pieces on the Terran integration program when it launched, and I'd done some background interviews then. But I'd always encountered them in the context of administrative roles, support functions, diplomatic settings. Never in a military environment where they had latitude to just be themselves without the overlay of official protocol. The first thing that struck me was the noise. Coalition military compounds are generally quiet, disciplined. Operational sounds, equipment running, vehicles moving, the constant low-frequency hum of power systems, but not much personal noise. Most species under military discipline trend toward compression. Smaller gestures, lower voices, controlled expressions. It's the nature of hierarchical stress environments. The Terran compound was loud. Not chaotically loud, not undisciplined, but present in a way I hadn't expected. There was music coming from somewhere. I later learned it was a practice the humans called playing tunes while you work, as if this was perfectly normal. Multiple simultaneous conversations happening in clusters at different volumes. Someone was doing something rhythmic and percussive near the equipment bay that turned out to be a human named Sergeant Cowery, beating on an overturned cargo container in a pattern she insisted was helping her think. Commanding officer was a woman named Colonel Yara Okonkwo. She met me at the compound gate with 2 other officers flanking her, and she had the quality that I would come to associate with the best Terran military personnel, a kind of careful, controlled alertness, like something that could move very fast was choosing, at that moment, to move slowly. She was not what I expected a frontline commanding officer to look like. She was lean rather than imposing, with close-cropped hair and a way of looking at you that felt less like being assessed and more like being actually seen. She shook my hand, the Terran physical greeting gesture, which I'd been briefed on, and she smiled, but the smile was careful. "You're the Tribune correspondent," she said. "Vex 7 Orendel, yes. You'll want to understand what we're doing here." "That's the hope, Colonel." She was quiet for a moment, looking at me in that seeing way. Then she said, "I'll be honest with you. The Coalition Council positioned this to the press as a standard auxiliary integration acceleration. That's not what it is." "What is it?" "A last option," she said simply. "And I need you to understand something about that before you start taking notes, because I've read Tribune reporting on human auxiliary units before, and you have a tendency to describe us in a specific way that I think is going to be unhelpful here." I raised an eye ridge, the Cathali equivalent of raising an eyebrow. "What way?" "Like we're interesting," she said. "Like we're novel, like we're a feature story about an unusual species doing unusual things." She met my eyes steadily. "What you're going to see here isn't unusual to us. It's what we do, and the galaxy treating it as unusual is part of why you're in the mess you're in." I stood there for a moment. Then I said, "I'll try to keep that in mind." She nodded and stepped aside to let me through the gate. The briefing happened that afternoon, the operational briefing, I mean, the one where Colonel Okonkwo laid out what Terran Division 6 was actually going to do. It was attended by the senior officers of all 4 Terran units that had been brought to Pella's IV, plus a handful of Coalition liaison officers who were there to coordinate the integration into the broader strategic plan. I sat in the back. The Coalition liaison officer was a Drethan named Commander Solus Varath, and he clearly had not spent a great deal of time working with humans before, because he kept doing a thing where he would make a statement and then visibly brace, as if expecting the humans to respond in some chaotic or unpredictable way. The humans consistently responded in a way that was clear and direct and not particularly chaotic, and each time this happened, Varath seemed slightly unsettled, as if the normality was itself suspicious. The core of the briefing was this. Terran Division 6, along with the 3 supporting units, was being assigned to a mission called Operation Turning Point. The tactical objective was to neutralize the Vethari dissonance array installations that were making Coalition shielding useless. If the array could be taken down, Coalition standard forces could engage on something approaching even terms. The problem was the array installations were on Vethari warships, heavily defended, deep inside enemy fleet formations. Getting to them required penetrating through the Vethari defensive perimeter, which was lethal to conventional coalition vessels. The reason the Terran units were being used was the thing that nobody in that room said out loud, but that sat in the air like something with weight. I'll come back to it. After the formal briefing concluded, the senior officers broke into smaller groups for tactical planning. I stayed near the back and watched. What struck me was the quality of the conversation, not just the content but the texture of it. The human officers argued with each other. Not hostile arguing, not the kind that damages working relationships, but a genuine, engaged, sometimes loud process of testing ideas by pushing on them. They interrupted each other. They said things like, "That won't work," and "I think you're wrong about that," with a directness that made Commander Varath visibly uncomfortable each time it happened. And then they would shift, seamlessly, without apparent friction, and someone who just had their idea challenged would say, "Okay, what if we do it this way instead?" And everyone would redirect and start testing the new idea with the same energy. I had never seen a military command structure operate like that, not in 43 conflicts. I pulled out my recorder and made a quiet note. Human decision-making appears consensus-adjacent but faster and more adaptive than Galactic Council model. Adversarial testing function built into planning process, worth examining further. Then I put the recorder away, because I had a feeling that what I was seeing was only the surface of something much larger, and I wanted to pay attention to all of it. Sergeant First Class Tamaz Reyes found me about an hour later, sitting against the compound wall trying to organize my notes, and asked if I wanted coffee. I had no idea what coffee was. I said yes anyway. He came back with 2 metal containers, the open kind you could see the liquid in dark brown, nearly black, steaming significantly. He sat down next to me with the comfortable ease of someone who sits next to strangers all the time and simply doesn't find it strange. "You're the reporter," he said. "Correspondent, yes. Vex 7, right? Unusual name. It's standard Cathali naming convention. The number indicates generational lineage." He appeared to consider this. "So there were 6 Vex before you. 6 direct lineage holders before me, who held the primary designation, yes." "That's kind of cool," he said with apparent sincerity. "We just pick names and repeat them. I'm the 4th Tamaz in my family line, but nobody marks it formally. It just repeats." He offered the second container. I took it, examined it. "What is this?" "Coffee. It's brewed from ground roasted beans. The beans come from a plant on Earth. It's kind of one of the foundational things. Don't ask me how to explain it, just drink it." I drank it. The sensation was complex. A kind of warmth, followed by a sharpness, followed by a bitterness that was somehow not unpleasant. My secondary taste receptors, which are more sensitive than my primary ones, registered something that I can only describe as urgent, like the liquid had an agenda. "It has stimulant properties," I said. "Oh yeah, absolutely. That's basically the point. You consume this regularly. Multiple times a day." I looked at the container. Then I looked at Reyes. He had a quality of contained, patient energy, sitting still, but with something behind it that was clearly very awake. "The caffeine content is significant," I noted. "We're used to it." He took a drink of his own, unhurriedly. "Most of us have been drinking it since we were teenagers. Your body adjusts." I made a note. Human biology appears calibrated to function with ongoing consumption of significant stimulant compounds. "Examine further." "Can I ask you something?" I said. "You're a reporter. Asking things is your whole job." "Correspondent," I said. "And yes," I paused. "In the briefing earlier, Commander Varath described the tactical parameters, the penetration into Vethari fleet positions, the objective to neutralize the array installations." Reyes nodded slowly. He described the projected risk parameters. Reyes continued nodding. The casualty projections, under optimal conditions, were high, Reyes said. "Extremely high." He was quiet for a moment. He turned the coffee container in his hands, a slow rotation that seemed almost meditative. "Yeah," he said. "Your command officers accepted the assignment without significant objection." "Yeah. I've covered 43 conflicts," I said. "I've been in a lot of military briefings. In my experience, when units are given casualty projections of that magnitude, there is protest, negotiation, a request for alternative options. Reyes looked at me sideways. He had brown eyes with a specific quality in them, something direct and unsentimental but not unkind. "We talked about it before the formal briefing," he said. "The officers had been briefed on the parameters earlier in the morning. There was discussion. And the discussion concluded that the mission was necessary, the risk was understood, and we were the ones who could do it." He paused. "It's not that we don't, it's not that the math doesn't register. It registers. But you either do the thing or you don't, and if you're going to do the thing, spending energy on wishing the numbers were different is it's a waste. We'd rather use that energy on making the numbers better." I watched him for a long moment. "Are you afraid?" I asked. He smiled. It was an odd smile, complex in the way that human facial expressions often are, with multiple things in it at once. "Of course," he said, "but being afraid and doing the thing anyway is sort of our whole thing, has been since we were living in caves." He finished his coffee. "Have some more," he said. "You've got a long day tomorrow." I spent the next 72 hours embedded in the compound, and I want to describe them carefully because they're the foundation for everything that came after. The Terran soldiers, all 4 divisions combined, roughly 4,000 personnel, were not what I expected. They were not what anyone in the coalition expected, based on the auxiliary integration reports I later reviewed. Those reports described the human units as promising and enthusiastic and adaptable, but requiring significant guidance in formal protocols. The kind of language that reads as polite management of low expectations. What I saw was different. The training exercises they ran in those 72 hours were unlike anything I had seen in a coalition military context. They were, and I'm going to use the right word here even though it sounds strange applied to military training, creative. The scenario planners would set up a tactical problem, and then the teams would solve it, but the solutions were rarely the obvious ones. They would find angles, workarounds, combinations of approaches that no formal tactical framework would have generated. There was a training scenario on the second day that I watched from the observation platform. The simulation parameters described a shielded Vethari position with 3 defensive gun emplacements, covering all standard approach vectors. The textbook coalition response, I looked it up, because I was taking notes, was a sustained bombardment of the position from maximum range followed by a direct assault vector, once shield strength dropped below 40%. 2 human teams were given 30 minutes to develop an approach. The first team spent 25 of those 30 minutes arguing with each other in a way that sounded, from the observation platform, exactly like a heated disagreement. Then they went quiet for 5 minutes. Then they submitted a plan. Their plan used 1 in-place unit as a deliberate distraction, a sacrifice play drawing fire from 2 of the 3 gun emplacements, while the main element went not around the position, but through a gap in the coverage that only existed for the duration of the distraction. The gap was 8 seconds wide. 8 seconds. The second team's plan was different but similarly unconventional. They'd identified a resonance frequency in the simulated shield matrix, and proposed a solution involving cycling their own shield emitters in a pattern that would generate destructive interference in the enemy shielding. Something no coalition tactical system would have tried because the margin of error was too small for standard targeting protocols to manage reliably. The human targeting protocols, it turned out, were not standard. I made a very long note after that session. The note started, "These units have not been used as logistics support because they are suited to logistics support. They have been used as logistics support because the coalition did not know what to do with them. That is a different situation." Colonel Okonkwo found me on the observation platform after the training session, when the teams were running debrief in the yard below. "Well," she said. "They're remarkable," I said. "No," she said, with a patience that felt like it had been exercised many times before. "They're normal, for humans, that's what I was talking about at the gate." I looked down at the teams in the yard. They were eating. The humans ate on a schedule that seemed almost deliberately frequent, small amounts at multiple intervals, another biological characteristic I'd noted, and debating the training scenario outcomes with the same engaged, argumentative energy they'd brought to everything else. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "You're a reporter. Asking things is your whole job. Correspondent, And that's exactly what Reyes said. She smiled briefly. Good phrase. Why hasn't the Coalition used Terran units in this capacity before? I asked. It seems the capabilities are evident. 8 years of integration program. Why logistics support? She was quiet for a moment. Below us, someone made a joke that I didn't catch and 3 people laughed. 2 reasons, she said finally. The first is cultural. Most Coalition species reach their current form through long periods of stability and formalization. Your societies are old. Your institutions are old. There's a way of doing things that has worked for a very long time, and introducing a new element into that framework requires the framework to adjust, and frameworks resist adjustment. And the second reason. She looked at me directly. She had a way of doing that, of creating the impression that there was no way to deflect or soften what was coming. The second reason, she said, is that some members of the Coalition Council were uncomfortable with what we are. I waited. There's a file, she said, an assessment file. It was commissioned 8 years ago, around the time of initial integration discussions, by a subcommittee of the Coalition Security Council. I've read it. The original classification was high enough that most senior officers don't know it exists. What does it say? She looked back down at the yard. It says that Terran biological and psychological profiles, when analyzed in the context of warfare, don't fit the standard galactic model. Every other spacefaring species in the Coalition has what the file calls a conflict ceiling, a point at which biological stress responses produce behavioral disorganization. Fear, essentially. The threshold varies, but it exists for every documented species. And humans. The file concluded that the Terran conflict ceiling, if it exists at all, is high enough that standard stress parameters couldn't locate it. She paused. They said, and I'm quoting from memory here, they said, Terran combat psychology appears to incorporate extreme adversity as a performance enhancer rather than a performance inhibitor. Under conditions that should produce shutdown, human units appeared to accelerate. The yard was still loud below us, still normal. They were afraid of that, I said. Some of them, yes, she said. It's a strange thing to be afraid of from our perspective. But from theirs, they understood something that we've always known but never had to articulate, because it was just always true. What's that? She was quiet for one more moment. That there's a category difference, she said, between species that evolved in comfortable conditions and found their way to space, and species that evolved in extremely hostile conditions and fought their way there. She looked at me again. We didn't develop intelligence the way most species did in ecological niches that supported us, that gave us time and safety to develop, to grow slowly into who we are. We developed intelligence under pressure, under predation. Under conditions where the species next to us wanted to eat us, and the weather wanted to kill us, and the bacteria in our own environment were constantly finding new ways to attack our bodies. For 100,000 years before we had anything that looked like civilization. She turned and walked toward the stairs. We're not remarkable, Correspondent Orandel, she said over her shoulder. We're just what happens when you spend 100,000 years not being allowed to quit. Operation Turning Point began at 400 hours Galactic Standard, on the 14th day of the 2nd month of the Vethari expansion campaign. I was embedded with the command element, not in a combat position, obviously, but in the communications hub where I could monitor the operational feeds in real time. Colonel Okonkwo had cleared it. She'd said, "You should see it, the galaxy should see it, that's why you're here." The tactical plan was, I want to try to explain this to someone who isn't a military specialist, because I think the details matter. The Vethari fleet was positioned in a formation they called the enclosure, 17 warships arranged in overlapping defensive coverage patterns, with the 5 ships carrying dissonance array installations positioned at the center. To reach those 5 ships, you had to get through the outer 12. To get through the outer 12, you had to survive the dissonance array, which was already active and covering the approach vectors. The Coalition analysis said it couldn't be done. That was the official assessment. The dissonance array made the approach vectors lethal, and without the array being neutralized first, there was no path to neutralizing the array. The human operational plan said, yes, it can. What follows is my attempt to describe what happened in the next 6 hours, as accurately as I can render it. The first element of the Terran force didn't approach the Vethari enclosure directly. They went wide, far wide, outside the array's effective range in small craft, very small craft. The human units had modified their auxiliary support vessels over the previous week in ways that the coalition logistics teams had found puzzling at the time. They'd stripped out most of the standard shielding systems and replaced the mass with additional engine capacity. Faster, less protected. From the Vethari perspective, a group of small, fast, lightly shielded vessels approaching from an oblique angle would read as exactly what it looked like. Vessels that could not survive a direct confrontation. Nothing in Vethari tactical doctrine would classify them as a threat. Their targeting systems were calibrated for coalition battle cruisers. These small things barely registered. That was the first thing the galaxy didn't understand about humans. They are willing to not look like a threat right up until the moment they are one. The small craft reached a position at the extreme edge of weapons range. From there, they started firing not at the warships, at the array installations specifically. Targeted fire at a range that, according to Coalition weapons assessment, was too far for meaningful accuracy. The hit probability at that range, with those weapons loads against a target of that size, was assessed at under 4%. The humans hit 7 out of every 10 shots. The array installations on 2 of the 5 central ships went dark in the first 11 minutes. I remember watching the tactical display in the command hub and feeling something I can't quite name. Not excitement. Excitement is a shallow thing, and this was deeper. It was more like the feeling of watching something inevitable, even though everything about the situation had been telling you it was impossible. The numbers on the display were changing, and my brain was insisting that numbers didn't work this way. Commander Varath, the Coalition liaison, was watching from a station to my left. He made a sound. Drethan vocalizations are subsonic mostly, but when a Drethan is surprised enough, something escapes into the audible range. He made that sound at the 11-minute mark. Then he went quiet and kept watching the display. The second element entered the picture when the array coverage dropped. The 2 neutralized installations created a gap in the dissonance array's coverage. Not a large one, not permanent, because the Vethari ships were already beginning repositioning maneuvers to close it, but large enough for a specific duration. The second Terran element had been waiting at the gap point. When the coverage dropped, they moved. What I need to explain here is the speed. Coalition combat doctrine is, again, based on centuries of institutional development, oriented around a certain pace. Ships move, engage, retreat, reposition. The tempo is deliberate. It has to be with the command structures and communications hierarchies involved. The Terran element moved like they'd been shot out of something. The gap was open for, according to the tactical recording I later reviewed in detail, 4 minutes and 17 seconds. In that window, the second element went through, engaged the nearest Vethari warship at close range, and created enough chaos in the Vethari repositioning maneuver to buy the first element time to reposition for a second engagement. The Vethari commander, I later read the intercepted communications, sent a fleet-wide alert at the 4-minute mark. The translation was approximately, "The small vessels are the primary threat, redirect defensive fire." By the time that order was processed through Vethari command hierarchy and implemented, the gap had closed, the first element had moved, and the second element was already somewhere the defensive fire wasn't pointing. I want to talk about a specific moment, because it's the one that stays with me most clearly. At about the 90-minute mark, Terran Division 3, one of the supporting units, was in a bad position. They'd taken significant damage during a repositioning maneuver. 2 of their vessels were disabled, and a Vethari destroyer had identified their position and was bringing weapons to bear. The tactical assessment in the command hub marked them red, in Coalition standard terminology. Red means, requires immediate strategic decision regarding extraction or abandonment. Division 3's commanding officer was a man named Major Elias Sundaram. I had met him briefly the previous day. A quiet man, methodical, with a habit of tapping 2 fingers against his knee when he was thinking. He came on the communications channel and he said, very clearly and without any particular emotional affect, "We see the destroyer. We're going for it." Going for it toward the destroyer that was targeting them. The Coalition tactical officer monitoring the feed, I heard her because the command hub was small and sounds carried. She said, "They're moving toward the hostile element." She said it with a specific tone, not alarm, bafflement. Colonel Okonkwo, who was at the primary display, didn't look up. "I know," she said. I know," Okonkwo said again, and her voice was patient. The patience of someone who has spent years explaining something that she shouldn't have to explain. Division 3 went for the destroyer. They went for it with 2 functional vessels, and one that was operating on emergency power. And they went at it in a pattern that no tactical algorithm would have generated, because no tactical algorithm would have considered the approach viable. They split, 2 vessels creating a wide engagement that forced the destroyer to track 2 separate targets. And the third vessel, the damaged one on emergency power, went straight at the destroyer's forward weapons array and hit it with everything it had left. The destroyer's forward array went offline. Division 3 had bought themselves 18 minutes of breathing room. I asked Sundaram about it later after the operation. I asked him about the decision, what the logic was, going toward the thing that was about to kill them. He thought about it for a moment. Staying still was certain death, he said. Going at it was possible death, and possible is better than certain every time. Were you afraid? I asked, because I kept asking that question. I couldn't stop asking it. Oh yeah, he said, but fear tells you what's important, doesn't mean you have to do what it says. 6 hours. The operation ran for 6 hours. At the end of it, the Vethari dissonance array was offline. Not partially offline, fully. All 5 installation ships had been neutralized. 3 of them had been boarded, physically boarded, Terran personnel in the Vethari ships. By teams that had gone through areas the Vethari considered impassable because they were open to space, using equipment that the Coalition Auxiliary Integration Program had listed as Emergency EVA Kit, and that the humans had decided was suitable for tactical infiltration. The Vethari enclosure was not broken, not yet. That would take the Coalition main fleet another 2 days, but the array was gone. And without the array, the Coalition shields worked. And with Coalition shields working, the math changed completely. The Vethari knew it. The intercepted communications from the Vethari command ship in the hours after the operation described something I can only translate as confusion shading into alarm. Their tactical doctrine had no framework for what had happened. Their assessments of the small Terran auxiliary units, which they had been monitoring at the same low-threat classification as the Coalition, had been built on the same assumptions the Coalition itself had made. A species that would go straight at a destroyer with a damaged ship. A species that would fire weapons at ranges the probability tables said were meaningless. A species that would board through open space because a door was locked. Nobody had told the Vethari that humans did things like that, because nobody in the galaxy had known. The aftermath. 2 days later, with the dissonance array down, the Coalition main fleet engaged the Vethari enclosure under conditions that finally made conventional tactics viable. The battle was significant. It wasn't easy, but it was possible in a way it hadn't been before. The Drenathi corridor held. I filed my report from a Coalition medical vessel 3 days after Operation Turning Point concluded. I wrote it over about 14 hours, stopping twice because I needed to think about what I was actually saying and whether I was saying it right. The editorial board flagged it. Orvas sent me the oxygen deprivation message. I wrote back, "I'll bring you the tactical recordings, watch them, and then tell me I'm embellishing." He watched them. He published the report without changes. But there's something I didn't put in that report. Something I'm putting here instead in this account, because the report was about events and this is about meaning, and meaning requires a different kind of writing. On the last night before the operation began, I couldn't sleep. My quarters in the compound were adequate but unfamiliar, and the recycled air had a quality that my respiratory system found slightly wrong, and I lay there in the dark thinking about the casualty projections and Ray's careful coffee, and Okonkwo's 2 reasons and Sundaram's possible is better than certain. I got up and walked out into the compound yard. It was local night on Pella's IV. The sky had 2 moons, a blue-gray one and a smaller pale yellow one, and enough light between them that you could see without enhancement. The compound was quiet in a relative way, power systems humming, distant activity at the perimeter checkpoints, the kind of quiet that isn't actually silence but feels like it. There was a figure sitting on the supply crates near the eastern wall. The same spot where I'd first seen the laughing group 2 days before. It was a young human, very young, one of the enlisted personnel, not an officer. She was looking up at the two moons with an expression I couldn't fully categorize, not afraid, not resigned, something more complex. The expression of someone who is holding a lot of things at once and has chosen, for this particular moment, to just hold them. She heard me approach and looked over. She had a container of coffee, they always had coffee, and she didn't look surprised to see me. Humans seemed, as a general quality, to not be surprised by things in the ways I expected. They were adaptable in their reactions. "Can't sleep," she said. "No." "Yeah," she looked back at the moons. "Me neither." I sat down on a nearby crate. The surface was cold. The night air had a slight chemical edge from the propellant residue that hung around all military compounds. We were quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" I said. She smiled just slightly. "You're a reporter." "Asking things is." "Correspondent," I said, "and yes." She laughed very quietly. "What made you join?" I asked. "The military, the coalition auxiliary program, all of it." She turned the coffee container in her hands. The same slow rotation that Rays had used. I wondered if it was something they learned or something innate, something about the physical act of holding something warm. "My grandmother told me a story," she said after a moment. "About her grandmother, during a war on Earth a long time ago before we reached space. Her grandmother was in a city that was being bombed. Every night bombed. And every morning the people in the city came out of the shelters and they cleared the rubble and they opened the bakeries and they went to work. They kept going." She said she never understood, as a young woman hearing the story, how people could keep going like that. How they didn't just stop. "And now..." She was quiet. "And now I think I understand that stopping didn't occur to them. That they didn't keep going because they were brave. I mean, they were brave, obviously, but they kept going because what else would you do? You either live or you don't. And if you're going to live, you might as well live like you mean it." The two moons moved slowly in the dark sky. "We're going to lose people tomorrow," she said, matter of fact, not distressed. "Probably some people I know." "Yes," I said, because she wasn't looking for comfort, and comfort would have been the wrong thing. "But the thing is," she said, "the people they're fighting for are real, the corridor is real. The species who need it to survive are real, and we can do something about it, so we will." She finished the coffee. "I've read some of your pieces," she said. "The Tribune runs them translated. You're good. You find the thing that other people miss." "I try." "Find the thing you're missing here," she said. "Whatever it is, it's the important part." She stood up, stretched, that full-body stretch humans do, arms and spine extended, like they're physically resetting themselves, and said good night, and walked back toward the barracks. I sat in the yard for another hour. I thought about what she'd said, about what Okonkwo had said. About Rays and Sundaram, and the laughing group at the beginning, and the coffee, and the music, and the beating on cargo containers, and the going toward the destroyer and the impossible accuracy at impossible range. I thought about the coalition assessment file that described a species without a measurable conflict ceiling. And I thought about what it meant, what it actually meant, that the galaxy had been so afraid of that. So afraid that they'd tucked humans into logistics roles and let them hand out medical supplies and support communications infrastructure for 8 years rather than reckon with what humanity actually was. Because the truth was this: the galaxy wasn't afraid that humans were violent. Violent species existed. The Vethari were violent. Plenty of coalition members had been violent at various points in their histories. The galaxy was afraid of something more specific, more unsettling. They were afraid of a species that had evolved past the survival instinct. Not past the will to survive, humanity still had that in abundance, obviously. But past the instinct, the one that fires in every other species and says, "Stop, this is the limit, this is where you must not go because the cost is too high." Every other species had that limit. It existed somewhere. You could find it in the projections, in the models, in the history. There was always a cost high enough to produce retreat. And humans had something instead of that limit. Something that didn't have a name in galactic standard, because no one had needed a word for it before. The young soldier had come close to naming it, without knowing she was naming it. What else would you do? Not bravery, not recklessness, Not even courage exactly, though courage was part of it. Something older. Something that had been ground into the biology of the species by 100,000 years of existence in conditions that should have killed them over and hadn't. The word I later decided was persistence, but that doesn't fully capture it either. It's persistence without exit. Persistence as the only mode available, not because they can't imagine stopping, but because stopping has never, at the fundamental level, felt like a real option. The galaxy had been afraid of that. I think they were right to be afraid of it. Not because it was dangerous to them, though it was, clearly, to the Vethari, but because it was a mirror, because it showed every old, comfortable, institutionally settled civilization in the coalition something it had been avoiding looking at for a very long time. What do you become when safety is so long established that the instinct atrophies? What is lost in the long generations of peace and stability when the pressure eases and the species never again has to ask what else would you do? Humanity hadn't had that luxury. Humanity had been asking that question, what else would you do, what else would you do, what else would you do, for 100,000 years. And the answer always was something. There is always something. Get up, try again, find the angle, go for the destroyer, fire at the impossible range, walk out into the debris and open the bakery. There is always something. That was what terrified the galaxy. Not that humans were dangerous, that they were a reminder. I went back to my quarters as the first pale edge of local dawn was beginning to lighten the horizon. I slept for 3 hours. Then I got up and went to the communications hub and watched human beings do, for 6 hours, what human beings do. And at the end of it, the war was changed. Not over, wars are never over quickly, and the Vethari expansion campaign dragged on for another 14 months in various forms. But the specific terror of the Dranathi corridor, the thing that the coalition had been certain was unresolvable, was resolved. By 4,000 people with modified support ships and impossible targeting accuracy, and the collective, quiet, ancient knowledge that stopping was not an option they had ever truly had. Colonel Okonkwo found me in the communications hub after the operation concluded and the feeds went quiet. She looked tired, the human version of tired, which is a specific thing, physical and visible in a way that some species don't show. But she also looked something else. Satisfied, maybe, not triumphant, just satisfied, like something had been done that needed doing, and it had been done. Well, she said. You were right, I said. About which part? All of it, I said, but especially the part about what I was missing. She sat down across from me. For a moment, she just breathed a slow, deliberate breath, the kind that humans take when they're doing the thing where they collect themselves. What are you going to write? She said. The truth, I said, which is going to make some people uncomfortable. Good. She picked up a coffee container from the table. They were everywhere, abandoned coffee containers, a permanent feature of human-occupied spaces, and looked at it and put it back down. The galaxy needs to be a little uncomfortable. It's been comfortable for a long time. Do you think they'll understand? I asked, when they read it. Do you think they'll understand what happened here? She was quiet for a moment. Probably not all of it, she said. Understanding things like this usually takes time. You have to sit with it. Let it change the way you see things slowly. She paused. But some of them will get it. The ones who are paying attention. The ones who are willing to look at the thing they've been avoiding looking at. What do you want them to understand? I asked. If you could choose one thing. She thought about it. And then she said, simply, without rhetorical weight or dramatic framing, the thing I put at the end of my Tribune report. That we were never meant to join your wars. We were supposed to stay in our corner of the galaxy, quietly, doing support work, not making anyone uncomfortable. And the reason that plan failed, the reason we're here, the reason today happened, is that the situation required someone to do something that everyone agreed was impossible. And impossible things are only impossible until a human decides they aren't. She stood up. Write that, she said. Write it clearly, and then let the galaxy decide what to do with it. She walked out. The communications hub was quiet. On the screens, the tactical feeds showed the Dranathi corridor, still intact, still open, 12,000 trade ships a year still flowing through it. I opened my recorder. And I wrote,